everybody. This is the first event of our Family Heritage Festival. And now I'm going to hand things over to our librarian, Jennifer. Hey, Jennifer.
Hello. Thanks everyone for joining us at our 6th annual Family Heritage Festival, even if it's looking a little bit different this year. We do have a couple more events this week, so you can see that link at the bottom of the screen, and we'll show it again later. So please check that out and you can see everything else that we have going on. And tonight we are bringing to you Remembering Zion, How a Black Cemetery Was Erased and Then Rediscovered by Drew Smith. But before we get started, I'm going to shout out a book to learn more about Tampa history. So our book today is African Americans of Tampa by Ursula Knox Odom. This is a great book that explores the skills, talents, and lifestyles of African Americans around Tampa who helped shape Tampa during its growing years. And it has great pictures that showcase the social and productive African American lifestyle. And you can find that in our catalog online with physical books or on Libby Overdrive for ebooks. And now we'll go ahead and I will introduce Drew Smith. Drew Smith is the genealogy librarian at the USF Libraries. He is host of the Genealogy Connection podcast and co-host of Genealogy Guys podcast. He is the author of Organize Your Genealogy, Strategies and Solutions for Every Researcher, and co-author of the book Advanced Genealogy Research Techniques. And now we'll turn it over to you, Drew, and thank you for joining us at our Heritage Festival this year.
Thank you so very much, Jennifer. And let me make sure I'm sharing the screen that I want to share here. Just make sure it's the right one. I believe that is the right one.
Yes, that looks great.
All right, thanks, Chris, thanks, Jennifer, thanks to the Hillsborough County Public Library Cooperative. I look forward to the Family Heritage Festival every year, and I think I've been involved in pretty much all of them, and I was so glad to get asked if I could come back and talk about a few things that are near and dear to my heart, in particular, this one, Remembering Zion. So again, yes, my name is Drew Smith, and as Jennifer said, I am the genealogy librarian at the USF Libraries. And I want to tell you a story of Zion Cemetery. I say a story instead of the story, because there are many stories that have been told about Zion, and I'm hopeful there will be many more stories about Zion that remain to be told. The story I will be telling you is from my own perspective. I imagine that my story will change in the coming years as I learn more. The toughest part of telling any story is to know exactly where to begin. Where does the story begin and what order of events to tell it? In the case of Zion, I think that it makes sense if we tell it starting from the time of the rediscovery in 2019 and then go back in time to the creation and active use of Zion until it was erased from history for nearly 100 years. I'll then share what I know about what happened to Zion between the time it was erased and mostly, but not completely forgotten, and the time when it was rediscovered. And then I can tell you about what has happened since its rediscovery. On June 23rd, 2019, a series of articles were published in the Tampa Bay Times. These articles were written by Tampa Bay Times reporter Paul Guzzo. And these articles alerted the readers to the existence of Zion Cemetery, which was an African-American cemetery located along North Florida Avenue. Paul had been alerted to the existence of Zion by Ray Reed, a retired Hillsborough County resident, who had been investigating the history of another cemetery, and he'd come across a large number of death certificates identifying a burial location of Zion Cemetery. Now, I want to mention that these death certificates are available to the general public through the actions of Family Search. Family Search is the genealogy arm of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So you can go to the familysearch.org website and you can search it for billions of records, but those include those death certificates for Florida. So Ray had never heard of this cemetery when he discovered it, and neither had anyone else that Paul contacted, except for a few longtime residents who recognized the name. It was suggested to Paul that the burials at Zion could have been relocated to other Tampa area cemeteries, such as Memorial Park on Dr. Martin Luther King Boulevard. but a comparison of the names of nearly 400 Zion burials found no more than 10 at Memorial Park or at Woodlawn on Ola Avenue. So where were all the other burials? And the next question was, where exactly was Zion Cemetery on a modern map of Tampa, or at least where had it been? So the image you're seeing here, Paul's research led to this map. This map had been filed with the Hillsborough County Clerk of Court's office in 1901, and it showed a location along Florida Avenue. You can see Florida Avenue along the left-hand side going up there, and it outlined nearly 100 cemetery lots. Each lot was capable of holding 8 plots or graves. So there was also a separate Potter's Field. You can see that on the north side there. So it's kind of an L-shaped piece of property. And the Potter's Field was normally reserved for those who could not afford a burial or a marker of any kind. Now, if you count up the possible total number of burials here, we're saying here that Zion could have held as many as 800 burials over its active use period. Now, if you take that 1901 map of Zion and you overlay it, as Paul did, on a modern map to see what's there now, this shows you where Zion was located. It turned out the land on which Zion had once stood was now part of property belonging to 3 different property owners. The largest part of the property was on the eastern end, and that's part of Robles Park Village, which is a large apartment complex originally constructed in the 1950s, and that's now public housing managed by the Tampa Housing Authority. The cemetery property lines indicated that it would be located under 5 of the Robles Park Village buildings. It's about 8% of the total Robles Park Village property, because there's a lot of buildings there, but 5 of the buildings would be right on top of that easternmost part, eastern and southern part of the property that was Zion. On the western end, along Florida Avenue, the property belonged to Richard Gonsmart, who's president of the Columbia Restaurant Group, who had purchased the land in early 2016 that was previously used as an old furniture store. He was using the property to support his restaurants and had the intention of constructing a culinary school for high school students. So that was his plans for his piece of the property. And again, understanding that he had no idea about Zion when he purchased the property. The property on the northern end, which is a lot of that Potter's Field, or some of that Potter's Field, not all of it, is now owned by a towing service called Target Recovery and Transport. Again, they had no idea that the part that they owned on that northern side had been part of a cemetery. So as Paul started looking into this history of Zion, looking at old newspaper stories, seeing again what then would have been the St. Petersburg Times and the Tampa newspapers, he found a 1951 newspaper story of the discovery of 3 infant caskets when they were constructing or beginning construction on the Robles Park housing project. And by the way, even though he tried to track down anything after that, it was never determined what happened to those 3 caskets. But it tells us there was some knowledge that, well, maybe there was a cemetery here when they started building the Robles Park housing project. Now, I saw these articles when they were published, and Paul was writing a lot of them as things were coming out and information was coming to light. Paul wrote a lot of articles for the Tampa Bay Times, and I saw those that were published on June 23rd, and my own first thoughts were, how can I help? Because several years earlier, I had been assisting some USF anthropologists led by Dr. Aaron Kimmerly. They were investigating the burials at the Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys. You may have heard of that, and there was certainly a lot of news coverage of the Dozier School up in the panhandle of Florida. And when I learned about it, I contacted Aaron back those years ago to volunteer my services as a genealogist to help identify living relatives of the deceased boys, so that when they found remains and they could do DNA testing, as they planned to do on the remains, because they hadn't identified who the boys were. They knew a list of boys' names a list of names of boys who had died while they were at Dozier, at least some of them. They didn't know who was who because there were no markers that indicated who was buried where. So I knew they would need to find relatives so they could do some DNA matching, and so I assisted that with that project. So when I heard about Zion, the first thing that I thought about was, okay, uh, those hundreds of individuals, and again, we weren't sure how many there could be. There could be 200, 300, 400, 700, almost up to 800, perhaps. Those individuals should have living relatives, people that might not know about Zion because a number of years had gone by. But I think these people, I felt they needed to know about Zion, that they had family who had been buried there. But if they knew about Zion, maybe they could shed some light on what happened to their buried family members. Maybe they knew the stories that had come down in their families. So I thought, okay, let me look at the death certificates that Ray Reid had already discovered and see if I can use those as the starting point of genealogical research to find the living family members. And I thought about that for several days. I thought, okay, I need to contact Paul Guzzo and let him know of my interest. Well, before I could even do that, Paul contacted me on June 29th because it turned out that he and I had a mutual friend, and the mutual friend had recommended my name to Paul as a genealogist who might be able to help Paul find documents indicating that the burials had been moved to another cemetery. And so I started looking into this as I communicated with Paul, and I started looking into the cemetery on July 2nd. And I met with Paul on July 3rd, and this again, we're talking about last year. And he gave me a copy of that file that had all those death certificates in it. And I got home from that meeting, and I began work. I was very interested in seeing what I could learn, and my idea was, how easy is this going to be? Will I be able to find living descendants just starting with that death certificate? So I began with one that had an unusual name, because sometimes it's obviously easier. I'm a Smith. I know that doing research with common names can be difficult. I thought I'd start with something that was a little more unusual. And here's one of the death certificates that I was given. And so the name was indexed as Alexander Brokey, although you can see here it says Abraham, and it says, and there's the name. Well, so I started looking into this, and I saw the name of the deceased, and I went down, there's an informant, the person that gave the information that was on the death certificate, and it said Henretta, and then the surname. And I'm looking for Alexander Brokey. I'm looking for Henretta Brokey. I'm not finding anything. So I do what I do in genealogy. I start playing with the alphabet a little bit and playing with the letters. And I took another look at the death certificate, and I'll zoom in so you can even see what I saw. And what I saw, here's the name. I realized that it wasn't a K as in Brokey, it was an X. The name was Broxy, Alexander or Abraham Broxy, and his wife Henretta Broxy. Because once I knew that it was that, I could then find information about him and his wife. So that meant I could find quite a bit about them. I'll share one thing. Here's an article that was in the Tampa Tribune from 1915 when Abraham dies. And so here we go. Here's Abraham Broxy. It's spelled this time O-X-I-E instead of O-X-E-Y. But again, we're in genealogical research, the spelling is not always going to be perfect because again, people write down what they hear. And so yeah, I saw this. It talked about him. It said he had a wife. He had two daughters. So I thought, okay, there could be descendants of those two daughters. It says that he was interred in Zion Cemetery. And so I thought, okay, so now I've got some information. Maybe I can find out some things. And I started looking, and I did. I used newspaper stories. I used census records. I used marriage records. I used more death certificates for his descendants. I used what's called the Social Security Application and Claims Index, which is a database on Ancestry.com. And I continually shared all this information with Paul Guzzo. So Paul and I were going back and forth and sharing a lot of information about the people that we knew to be buried at Zion. And again, was it possible to find living descendants? And it looked like it was going to be possible. And then I went to a meeting on July 6th. July 6th was the Saturday, July 6th was the monthly meeting of the Florida Genealogical Society, which is the local genealogical society, the oldest. In fact, the Florida Genealogical Society in Tampa is the oldest genealogical society in the state of Florida. And it's just, I think recently is celebrating its 60th year, but it's been in existence quite a while. And I would normally go to their monthly meetings as much as I could. And those were held when they had, face-to-face meetings. Those were held at the John F. Germany Public Library. So I went to their meeting on July 6th of 2019, and the topic of Zion came up during the meeting, and many of the people clearly had now read these stories in the Tampa Bay, in the Tampa Bay Times, and they wanted to help. They wanted to volunteer. So fortunately, there was a volunteer coordinator who could kind of deal with that. And so in late August of 2019, that coordinator emailed their whole membership, which was well over 100 members, to see how many of them would be interested in volunteering and to help with this and finding these living descendants using their genealogical skills to do that. And so many of them did that and expressed their interest. Now, some other things that were going on during that July timeframe. One was, I already mentioned that the Tampa Housing Authority owned a big piece of the property. And so they pulled together a committee in mid-July of 2019 to oversee these investigations. They included representatives from the city of Tampa, from the NAACP, from the Robles Park Apartments Residents Council, from the Florida Public Archaeology Network, or FPAN as it's called at USF, and from CARDNO, C-A-R-D-N-O. CARDNO is a private archaeological assessment company that could work with FPAN to use ground penetrating radar to detect graves. So in early August, FPAN and CARDNO began their work. And so they started scanning the ground there where Zion was. They had permission from the Tampa Housing Authority to scan between the buildings, because you can't scan under them. But they went between those 5 buildings in the open areas, the grassy areas or the paved areas, but not the areas that were built on top of. And they identified locations that basically, from their experience, were 144 caskets that were under that property. They also went and looked at, and then there were other companies that were used, or same company or other companies that were used to do the same thing under the property that was owned by the wrecking company's tow, the wrecking company for their tow lot, and the Gonsmart property. And they actually found another 115 under the piece of property that belonged to Gonsmart, and they found another 55 under the property that the wrecking company owns. So basically a total of 314 were found so far. And of course, again, remember, they couldn't look under the constructed buildings that were on top of some of these pieces of property, particularly those 5 buildings that were part of the apartments. So I began exchanging email with Rebecca O'Sullivan. Rebecca Becky's a public archaeology coordinator too for the FPAN's West Central Regional Center. And what Becky and I were able to do is sort of created what we believe to be an authoritative list. Again, based on those death certificates, I went through and looked at all of them again myself, the ones that were collected, because I wanted to verify the names and make sure that they weren't mistranscribed, and put all the names and put all the images in a very formatted sense so we could see exactly who they were. And so I checked all those names again, and Becky and I worked on that together to kind of create that sort of authoritative list. So I was able to, in fact, in September, this was late September of 2019, I had attended the meeting of that committee I mentioned that was hosted by the Tampa Housing Authority, and I was given the opportunity to introduce myself. And I expressed my interest and willingness to lead the efforts of volunteers to discover the names of those living descendants of people buried at Zion. You know, I've said this quote a number of times. It's been picked up in some of the TV coverage or the newspaper coverage, but it's not original with me. But it's basically the idea that human beings die twice. They die when their bodies die, and they die the second time when the last person alive says their name. And I said that we need to take these names of the people that were buried at Zion and say their names and bring them back to life. So in other words, tell their stories. Now, there were other events going on. Florida Conversations is a series of events that's co-sponsored by the Tampa Bay History Center and the USF Libraries. And back in October of 2019, they had one on the story of Zion. So they actually hosted a panel. It had people there like the representative from the Tampa Housing Authority, Paul Guzzo, Becky, and some others who were involved. And so they discussed the history of what they had found so far and what they plan to do after that. Now, I already mentioned that I had gone to the Florida Genealogical Society to say to them, hey, does anybody want to volunteer? Do you know about this project? Because genealogists often are very eager to help out with projects that have a genealogical component to them. And so I thought, well, there's another group in the Tampa area, and that's the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society of Tampa. And so I went to their meeting in October of 2019, and I asked if I could speak. That meeting, it was held at the Robert W. Saunders Senior Public Library branch of the public library system in Hillsborough County. And I told what I knew, and I also asked if there was anyone interested, and they could contact me if they wanted to volunteer to help out. So there were certainly a lot of interested people that were at that meeting that wanted to hear the story of Zion. Now, since that time, a couple of things to bring you up to a little bit more to date almost, and then I'm going to go back, as I said, back in time to the history of Zion in a little bit more detail. The Tampa Housing Authority began that relocation process. People that were living in the 5 buildings that were on top of Zion, they moved them to other housing that they were under the Tampa Housing Authority control. And once they had moved all those individuals away from those 5 buildings, they built a fence to separate the rest of Robles Park Village from that property so that they could give it its privacy and give it its, so that they could control access to it. And genealogy volunteers started work. I created a Facebook tool to enable all of us to talk, but then I ran into the issue that I realized there were volunteers who weren't Facebook users, and I understood that. So in February of this year, in 2020, I actually created a mailing list for the volunteers, and there's been some communication there, but we've kind of been on some hiatus since the world has changed since mid-March. But I did spend a lot of my time in 2020 talking at the libraries about we're going to need to have a website that can host what is found about Zion, the history of Zion, the maps of Zion, the stories of Zion, the media links to the newspapers and the TVs, the recorded TV stories and whatnot, and the oral histories, because we knew that was going to be a thing. People were going to interview descendants. They were going to interview residents of Robles Park apartments. They were going to interview other community members to say, what did they know? What did they learned? So I did get approval. I worked my way through the USF Libraries Administration, got approval, and started to draft what that website would look like. And I was assisted by the USF Libraries webmaster. I shared the design with Becky O'Sullivan of FPAN. She shared it with the rest of the Tampa Housing Authority task force, who could give a little bit of feedback. Now, let's move forward to mid-July of this year. So in mid-July of this year, USF, as of July 1, is now a single university with multiple campuses. We have campuses in Tampa, in St. Petersburg, and in Sarasota, Manatee, under a single university. And the university decided to announce a call of proposals for internal research grants to address anti-Black racism. And Dr. Antoinette Jackson, who's the chair of USF's Department of Anthropology, she led a team of USF faculty to respond to this call and proposed a project called African American Burial Grounds and Remembering Project. This project is focused, at least in its phase one, it's certainly focused on Zion Cemetery. It's also focused on Oak Lawn Cemetery in St. Petersburg, which is different than the Oak Lawn Cemetery in Tampa. Oak Lawn Cemetery in St. Petersburg is under the parking lot of Tropicana Field. And this project was awarded the grant, one of the 23 that were awarded, the number that were awarded. And the project team has now been starting to meet and is going forward with this research. And I'm going to share with you at the end of the presentation how you can contact Dr. Jackson if you have any information that can be useful to the African American Burial Grounds and Remembering Project. So you'll be able to contact her and make sure she gets that information. Oh, one more thing about the project. Again, this project is a partnership with the community. It's definitely, you know, that was one of the things that all the projects were trying to do is how can USF partner with the local communities in challenging this kind of racism that essentially erased Zion and other cemeteries in Tampa Bay. So the partners, the Robles Park Village, the Robles Park Tenant Council Association, in St. Petersburg, the Carter G. Woodson African American Museum are some of the organizations. That's not an exhaustive list of that are working together to create this model so that Florida can remember these forgotten African American burial grounds. But as I said, the primary focus is to collect those stories from the community, from the descendants who are the families, and preserve those stories so that this won't be forgotten again. There's Antoinette's email. So if you can reach Dr. Jackson at atjackson@usf.edu, and I'm sure she would love to hear from you. I'll have that up again near the end of the session of the PowerPoint slides, so you can make sure to see that. So let's talk about the history, because I mean, there's still a lot we don't know. There's still a lot that, you know, it was never well covered, even in the newspaper. Some of it is, and again, I want to credit particularly Paul Guzzo for doing most of this work and this research. But he quickly, you know, looked at the archives of newspapers and put together, and here's a timeline of some of what was learned. So we start in 1894. The land was originally purchased by Richard Doby. And Doby was an African-American entrepreneur who did own a lot of property in that area. And he bought that land for the cemetery in 1894. We know, as I mentioned earlier, that the map of Zion was filed with the clerk in the county in 1901. Now, he sold this property to a company called Florida Industrial and Commercial Company in 1907. So he had it from 1894 when he bought it to 1907 when he sold it. In 1912, there was a former Confederate commander named James J. Head, and he claimed he owned the Zion property because he had paid the back taxes. I don't know exactly what ended up going on with that, because it appears that Florida Industrial continued to own it. So it didn't get transferred to Head. It was still under the control of Florida Industrial. But in 1916, Florida Industrial and a commercial company had a debt, and they auctioned the property. And they don't know at this point yet, we don't know who bought it in 1916. And there were still burials going on. I should be clear about that. The burials continued through the ends of the teens and into the earliest years of around 1920 or so, just for a year or two. In 1923, we no longer get to see Zion appearing in the city directories of Tampa. There's, I should mention John F. Germany Public Library has a wonderful collection of Tampa city directories, and so you could look up, what businesses were where, things that were there. Zion no longer showed up in the city directory as of 1923. And that's also when we think some of the last burials happened somewhere along in there. 1926, Alice Fuller, we don't know quite how she acquired it. So, we don't think necessarily she's the buyer from the auction, but but again, that's sort of still a mystery. So there's still some research to be done on who owned it from 1916 until Alice Fuller sold it in 1926. When did she buy it? We don't know. She sold it to an H.P. Kennedy, and he got permission in 1929 to build a storefront on Florida Avenue. So he owns that storefront property, that property along Florida Avenue, and he gets permission to build on it. And then, as I mentioned, in 1951, when they began the construction on Robles Park apartments, they found those 3 infant caskets. And so the city claimed at the time of 1951 that they had relocated all of the burials back in 1925, but there is no record of that. So that's, of course, again, one of those mysteries of, why did they think that, what prompted them to say that? We don't know. So again, kind of where we are before, and then I'll take some questions here. If you have questions about the African American burial ground and project that involves Zion, involves Oak Lawn over in St. Petersburg, please contact Dr. Antoinette Jackson, again, atjackson@usf.edu. If you have anything that will clear up any of these mysteries, or of information that could be relevant to any of these, particularly these 2 cemeteries, please contact Dr. Jackson. She would love to hear from you, and she can take it from there. If you're curious about the work I've done with the genealogy, contact me. I would love to hear from you as we continue to work on finding living descendants or relatives of those that are buried, that were buried at Zion based on the death certificates. And I'm going to start looking at Oak Lawn as well, because I have not yet seen a list of those names. You can contact me. My email address is pretty easy. It's dsmith@usf.edu. So I guess I want to say, there's still a great deal to be learned about the history of Zion, about the stories of the nearly 800 individuals who are likely still buried there. And as I mentioned, the ongoing research work by the African American Burial Grounds and Remembering Project calls for anyone to contact Dr. Jackson as soon as you can. The project team, again, is not just researching, collecting historical information, but also interviewing and recording the stories of those who live in the community or connected in some way to these cemeteries. And again, if you can help, please let Dr. Jackson know. I'll be glad to take any questions you might have of anything I shared with you tonight, and especially about this research process and what was involved in that. So at this point, let's see, I think I'm going to stop showing my screen and we'll take it from there. Right, Jennifer?
Yes. So we have a couple questions already, but certainly if you guys have any more questions, put them in the question box and we'll read as many as we can. So the first question that came up is, have you heard of any plans to memorialize the area or do anything there?
Yeah, let me talk about what little I know. I know a little bit from what's, again, been covered in newspaper stories, from meetings I've attended of the task force. One of the plans is to try to create a foundation who can, because someone's going to have to own this property. The eventual plan is to create a memorial park. That is the long-term goal. But that means that there's going to have to be an owner of the property, so that even if the Tampa Housing Authority just donates their piece, if they can do that, they were planning on redeveloping because of the age of the Robles Park apartments. Now that they're about 70 years old, they were next in line, as it happened to be redeveloped for a brand new assisted, an affordable living facility. And so, but the problem is also they're going to have to be some reimbursement of the other two property owners, of Mr. Gonsmart and of the towing company, because they really can't afford just to give up their property. They are going to need something to make up for that, so they can move their businesses elsewhere. So part of it is the funding. That's going to be, so the foundation, I think, is going to be try to come into existence so we can collect monies, make it possible to not only however that's done, and I don't, again, I don't have all the details here, is whether that money is going to have to be the money used to purchase the other two pieces of property or just what. But the plans are to then, once all three pieces are reassembled, is to start work on a memorial park. There's currently a fence, as I say, around the one piece at least of this, with names. I've seen the pictures of it. It's got all the names we already collected of people believed to be buried there. So the names are on the fence so that you can kind of look around and see how many hundreds of names there are. But I know that the plan, and that was one of the more recent articles in the last month or two I've seen about some designs of what could a memorial look like. They're not going to move the graves. There's no plans to relocate any of the burials. They are just planning on making it an appropriate place for people to come to sit, to reflect, to think about the history of the people that were there, their stories. I know these things take time. They take time for financing. They take time for physical construction. They're going to have to demolish the buildings that are already there. I mean, we are obviously, and this is going to take a few years to do. And in a way, that's kind of good. It's going to take us a few years to do all the good genealogical research to find all the families, because I would love to be there the day that they open that memorial park and invite to that opening celebration living descendants and living relatives of the people that are buried there to be part of that remembering. I hope to see that. But as I said, I realize it could be a couple years from now.
Great, thank you very much for sharing. And that's a perfect segue into the next question, which is how many living descendants of those buried have been located so far?
So that's a little tough question, because we've had volunteers kind of going off in their own direction. We're still trying to kind of keep it a little more coordinated, and that's been more difficult than I had imagined. But I want to say that we have probably found descendants for about a dozen of the families, half dozen to a dozen of the families. One of the issues with finding descendants, there's several. One of them is that, of course, descendants may not have stayed in Tampa. We talk about the time period, the 1920s, the Depression. Large numbers of African Americans left the South and went north for job opportunities, went to the cities. So you end up with people in Detroit and in Chicago and in New York and in all other places where they could find jobs in industry. And so it can be harder to trace once they leave the area. Some are still local, some did not leave, and I know that from some I've seen. And of course, some there are no living. Well, there may not be any living descendants. I mean, there can be obviously cases where, the children did not have any children, or the grandchildren didn't have any children, or whatever. And of course, the times we're talking about is over 100 years ago that the burials happened around that time. So, the numbers are still small, but I want to say, I know it's going to say, we've been working on some of this since about a year, but the numbers are still small. It's going to take time. The more volunteers we get, the more we'll find, the more people we can get involved, the more we'll be able to find. Part of it, again, is the structure. How do we make it so that we know who's working on which names? That's always a trick, is to say who's assigned what block of names to do research on. And so some of that is probably going to involve, as we create this website that is part of the it's even part of the research project that that we're doing at USF, is so we can start to pull all that that genealogical information together, so we can kind of track and keep track of who's been discovered so far. I bet you, though, I have no doubt there are going to be individuals we're going to find had no clue that they have ancestors that were buried at Zion. That story did not make its way down. Some of that is sadly because, quite frankly, I think there were people living through those were very tough times for African Americans to live through. We're talking about the time of Jim Crow. We're talking about the time when, yes, it's an African American cemetery, but the white buyers didn't care. They didn't relocate the graves. They just built on it. And there was no way for anybody to speak up because they would get in trouble if they spoke up. And, Paul and I have had these discussions quite a few times. Why didn't people speak up? Well, they couldn't. Um, and of course, the dead can't speak for themselves. They depend on the living to speak for them. But that was not a time when you wanted to rock the boat, and you had living families. That I know of families that lived right next to the cemetery who had families buried there. And I bet you anything they had children. And I bet you anything they said, we can't say anything or do anything because we have to protect our children and we don't want any repercussions. So I'm, sad as that sounds, I'm sure there were people that probably didn't even want to share that story with their grandchildren or great grandchildren because it was just too sad to deal with. But yeah, I'll leave it at that point, I guess. It is a very tragic story in any way you look at it.
Yes, it certainly is. We have a couple questions about the website that you've talked about. It sounds like it's not yet available to the public. Do you know when it is expected to be?
Great question. I mean, I'll be honest, I think that based on the website is intended to be now linked to the new project that's been funded, the grant funded project, and that project pretty much has to be completed within 1 year. So in some ways, I don't know that that means we'll be able to release some of it before then, like maps and some things, or whether it's all going to be released kind of at the end of that year. We say, here it is. We haven't had those discussions yet. We're still in the early stages. So I would hope that within, sometime, I guess I'll put it this way. I hope that sometime next year by the summer, I'm hoping it'll be available. But the thing that's happened is also this website is not going to be just about Zion now. We know it's going to be about Zion and Oaklawn. So that's even going to change the structure of the website somewhat. It's going to be a little bit broader. So yeah, there's still a lot of work to be done on it. So I'll say I'm hoping that sometime in 2021 you will see a website that you can visit and learn about Zion, look at and Oaklawn, and learn about the maps and learn about the stories and see some of the oral histories. Listen to the oral. We plan to get permission from as many people as we can to record their oral histories. Make those available on the USF Library's website. So there'll be links from the website so you can hear the stories in their own voices. That's the plan.
Excellent, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell us about some of the sources that you used to discover the history of all of the property?
I'm going to say I'll credit Paul for that. I know that he looked at a couple things. I'm sure he looked at newspaper stories. Newspapers do cover property transfers. So, there's usually a column in every newspaper that says so-and-so sold something to someone else. So my guess is some of that was used to do the transfers. The other thing is usually in the courthouse, there's usually land records and property records that show things being transferred from one person or company to another person or company. So my guess is he did some research either himself or got someone to do it for him in the property records of the county, because that's where they're normally kept. But I didn't do as much on that myself. I was looking more at the individual stories or the genealogical research on the individuals as opposed to but that doesn't mean I'm not going to go back and take another look at that. The history is still a lot to be told. There's still so many gaps in the history, and my guess is there's some more to learn. That trouble with some of it is that the African American newspapers of the time, or the newspaper of the time, there was one later on, doesn't exist anymore. Nobody has copies of the one that existed in the either 20s or 30s or early 40s. We only have the Florida Sentinel Bulletin now, I think, I want to say back to 1945. So we're missing out on, because some of this stuff simply wasn't covered by essentially the white newspapers, the Tampa Tribune or the St. Petersburg Time or the Tampa Times. They didn't cover stories that of that nature. Later, there would be, of course, as we were doing research on the descendants, eventually we could find mention of them in the Florida Sentinel Bulletin, among other places. Although some of you saw the article about Broxy, he was apparently thought of by enough people that they actually got a brief mention of him in the newspaper, which essentially the white newspaper. And the same thing when his wife died some years later. She's not buried in Zion. She was buried after Zion had already closed up. But she was also very successful businesswoman and owned a lot of property. So she ended up with an article about her when she died that was in the paper. So yeah, there's still a lot to be done with newspaper stories about the stories of these individuals, hopefully. I want to share one other statistic because I want to put some of these in perspective. We've talked about how many hundreds of people are buried in Zion, one I'm most familiar with. I want to say this. I think if I have my numbers right, about 40%, maybe it's 20 to 40% of the burials are infants. A lot of infant mortality from the late teens and early 20s. And of course, especially if we're talking about an economically disadvantaged group, there's a lot of stillbirths and a lot of infant burials and child burials. The sheer number was astounding. I even found one example of a family. I wasn't sure if I had a duplicate death certificate or not. I was trying to make sure I had the right names and I was naming the death certificate files. I found one case of a husband and wife who lost 2 different infants in the same calendar year. So it was just heartbreaking to think that there was so much of that going on at that time when infant mortality was incredibly high.
Yes. Let's see, we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. So let's see. One here is, have you come across any documents that show that Mr. Kennedy knew that there were bodies buried there?
I have not myself seen a document that talks about what he knew. And I'm going to say, I guess I'll go out on a limb, I doubt we'll ever find something like that. If he knew, and I want to say you kind of think he knew, I think he didn't care. But we'll probably never see an actual article written that says that he's building a storefront on something he knows to be a cemetery. He's just, that was in 29. And remember that there was that story that the city had moved, or in 1926, 1925, that the burials were moved, which we know now not to be true. But that may have been the story that was told when people started wanting to build on that property. They may have simply shared that in the 20s, late 20s, even though I bet you anything, the people that had people buried there knew better. They knew the real story. But I've not seen anything that talks about what H.P. Kennedy knew or didn't know. Yeah.
All right. Do you know if there have been any military veterans among the buried there?
That's an interesting question. Because of the time frame, it would have been probably veterans. It could have been veterans of World War One. Because again, we do have burials from the late 19 teens up to like the first couple of years of the 1920s. I don't know if it is. I haven't seen that. I don't remember seeing it on the on the death certificates that could have, but so I would have to find that in other records probably, and I haven't looked for that. That's a great question. So all I'm going to say is I don't know. I don't know how many veterans could be part of that burial of Zion. It could be, and I know there are earlier wars, I suppose, that they could have been involved with and veterans of, but I'll be honest, that's kind of an area of U.S. history I'm not too strong on. So it's something I need to learn more about. It's one of the reasons I've truly enjoyed working on this project so far is I'm very early on this process. I'm starting to learn myself a little bit of the history of Tampa from this time frame. I want to know more about what Tampa was like in the very end of the 1890s all the way up to the mid-20s. What was Tampa like? And in particular, what was Tampa like for African Americans? I want to know a lot more about that, because I'm not a native of Tampa, so I didn't even grow up and learn that much about it. And usually the things that when you move in and you move into Tampa, you learn about things that Tampa's proud of because they're proud of Ybor City and cigar making and the ports and things of that nature and the railroad. And they're probably not going to tell you much about, and this is how we treated our African American citizens. They just don't talk about that very much. So that's why these research projects that I mentioned that USF is funding, that's why this project is so critical. There's so much history that has been ignored and forgotten. So whether, as you asked Jennifer about military, all of that, I'm sure there are, again, so many stories that need to be told that haven't been told yet. So while it's sad that they've been forgotten stories, it's exciting that they are stories to be revealed and to be shared. So I'm kind of hoping that we're going to be able to hear a lot more of these stories in the coming years.
All right, thank you very much for sharing. So that sounds like a good note to add on. We have a couple people asking about contact information, so we'll post that again in the box. Drew, do you want to share your contact information one more time if anyone wants to get in touch?
Sure. So if you want to get in touch with the genealogy aspects of this project, or anything I might have said that you want to hear a little more from me in details, email me at USF. That's dsmith, so it's the easy one for Drew Smith, dsmith@usf.edu. If you have information that you think will be of value to the research project that Dr. Antoinette Jackson is heading up, please email Dr. Jackson at atjackson@usf.edu. I'm sure she will be excited to hear from you.
All right. I posted both of those in the chat section. Yep. So
thanks, Chris.
Sure. I'm going to go ahead and bring up our farewell slide here. Thank you for being with us tonight, everyone. If you want to contact the library, you can call the number here on the slide, or you can go online and contact us there. And of course, as Jennifer mentioned, the landing page that we have for Family Heritage is hcplc.org/family history. And there's also a lot of genealogy resources that you can also access at the URL at the very bottom of this slide, hcplc.org/research/genealogy. Thank you, Drew. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, everyone, for being with us tonight. I hope you all will join us tomorrow night for our second event, which is DNA and ethnicity. That'll be at 6:30, and you can register for it at the URL on the screen. So with that, I will say good night and thank you to everyone. Thank you. Good night.
Good night, everybody.